think that literature is not just something we read, it's something that constructs a shared world that brings us together. When more people have more texts to choose from that are more common and are more inclusive, we think you get better representation of marginalized artists. You bring people together, you allow critique to be effective. We are very proud to stand in open government. On framing, what do we think this looks like? I think broadly, when you're choosing an inclusive canon, you choose a couple of factors that are important. The A is national classics of a lot of different countries. Things like Chinua Achebe in Nigeria, including that in your curriculum because it was something that was meaningful, and things like global history, which we want to talk about. The B is marginalized artists within your own country. People like Toni Morrison in the United States, who come from a marginalized background. People like Zora Neale Hurston. C, I think people who might be more contemporary that you think are important to include in order to try to get students' attention, have some amount of entertainment. People like Zadie Smith, which are very entertaining to read and also come from marginalized background. Second, I think a lot of times the way these norms are set is that they start with scholars at the top and then they tend to trickle down from multiple different mechanisms. You have curricula that are set by school that look to what literary people at Harvard are saying is important to need to read right now. Things like awards that tell you what books that are popular right now are very good. People who've been involved in critique for a very long time, that teachers grow up studying when they get their degree in English. We think on our side, you're more likely going to have these people who come from top institutions, who engage a lot with literary theory, who think a lot about critique and set these curricula. I think that they have good incentives for a couple of reasons. The first is that these fields, just by their very nature, tend to be very progressive and tend to be very leftist, in a very particular way. It's one in which you're forced to question your own internal biases and expand as much as possible because you want to consume a lot of art and you want to be open to a lot of different art. The second is that I think you tend to scrutinize more these own standards that you set, because it's very popular for your colleagues to come forward and say things like, you're setting a curriculum that is exclusive, and you're not including a lot of people who are up and coming, who are very important that we should pay attention to. I therefore think that the majority of these curricula are going to look very good. Our first argument is that a literary canon leads to greater representation for marginalized artists. I think in the absence of literary canon, you're going to trend toward less diversity for a couple of reasons. The first is that I think that teachers in places like high school and professors in college are going to choose books that they're more proximate to and have personal connections with. And this is something that's pretty bad, because the contemporary media that people engage with right away oftentimes isn't something that comes from artists with a lot of marginalized background. You might have Kurt Vonnegut that is pretty popular in the 1960s and you grew up thinking was pretty cool, but it's unlikely that if you came from a place in a time which was more regressive, that you decided to engage with a lot of stuff from people with other countries. You didn't read books like The Kite Runner that inform your perspective. The second is you have a lot of pressure from below on their side. And it's absolutely true that you have parent-teacher associations that are calling out schools and saying that they're doing things like indoctrinating students or like going back on our values. But if you're able to point to people like Toni Morrison and say, look, this is valuable just because it's a part of American culture, if you reinforce this narrative over time, it is harder for PTAs to have this kind of influence. The third is just on a basis of random selectivity, right, which I think is something that they create on their side, you're more likely just probabilistically going to select more privileged authors because those are the ones that tend to rise up in the world. On our world, you make a very conscious effort to try to include artists from marginalized backgrounds, meaning you are at least comparatively better. Why do we think that this is something that is comparatively worse on their side? Because one, there's a greater pressure to engage in trend following on their side. When you look at the books that are most popular right now, the people who are most able to do things like fund book tours, the people who are most likely going to have connections with media, which, surprise, surprise, tends to be the people who are most privileged and tend to have the most connections. The second is you just choose comfort stories. You try to make sure that you get students to be entertained because that's what you prioritize first and foremost when you don't have a canon to choose from that you're pushing towards. And this is something that tends to be quite bad because it means that you're including less challenging topics and less challenging authors from different backgrounds. But for I'll take a point from closing.
Yeah, presumably those book awards and book tours you describe are kind of constructed by the work sets of people in academia you described in the first part of your speech. Surely they set these trends in progressive ways.
Yeah, but we're talking about academia in our world with a literary canon, right? Like academia in your world without a literary canon, yes, might still have good incentives, but those incentives get far, far worse when you're not supposed to scrutinize what your curriculum looks like and think about what you're thinking about when you give out book awards. Opening.
I think Koji overclaims what actually changes, because there's definitely still all the same pressures from PTAs or all the same pressures from a school that sets curricula. The question is if the existence of the canon itself better informs or worse informs these decisions.
I think I was pretty nuanced about those mechanisms. I don't think you responded to that properly. Maybe Rohan can do some reconstruction if you really think that was a good response. Let's talk about the best case scenario in which you get a lot of different entertainment. Here's the thing, I'm not sure why that matters. I think a lot of students get entertainment from other sources, and in either world they're always going to say, TikTok, more fun than go read book, right? So I don't know if that's something that's going to stick with them. And our world, yeah, maybe you give up 5 books and only one sticks out to you, but things like reading, like things fall apart, genuinely impacted my life a lot. It made me think about a lot of things. Even if it's only the like one fucking book I remember from high school, we think that's meaningful or valuable. It changes the way that we think about other artists, it changes the way we think about other people, and that's something worth paying attention to. The impacts of this are, first, you just get more lived experience engagement across different sections of society. More privileged people are able to have more empathy from people who come from more marginalized backgrounds. The second is that it helps people become blossoming writers. More people who are from marginalized backgrounds who read Toni Morrison think, I can use this as a mentor, that I am willing to grow up and become this person, even if my teacher, who's white, does not fully understand me, meaning you're more likely going to get more writers from more diverse backgrounds, and that's very impactful. Our second argument is why it is good to have a depth of engagement and more standardized critique. We think you have more standardization on our side of the house for a couple of reasons. The first is that you're able to teach these books in a way that you know is compelling, where you're able to teach test your curricula in multiple different places, see what students engage with, see what policy experts think is a good way to talk about this book, as opposed to on their side, where you have a more fragmented curricula. The second is that you know how to teach this well, where you as a teacher who might not have had a personal upbringing with thinking about things like the ghosts of slavery and colonialism, now know that a lot of literature around this canon talks about slavery and colonialism, and you have to talk about these aspects in class at least once. Maybe you don't do it super well, but we think it's going to connect to a lot of marginalized students in instances that are valuable. Why does this inspire people? I think just because it allows for a better, common language that allows criticism, that allows certain people who are involved with criticism to more effectively make their voices heard. Where if I'm going to say that I'm a literary canon that I'm drawn from, where I'm talking about people like Shakespeare, and I'm talking about people like Toni Morrison, as opposed to 2 authors that my teacher just so happened to choose, I'm more likely going to do things like get published in student magazines, get published in academic journals over time, because people recognize the things that I'm saying. This means that criticism can get more diverse, it can bring more people into it, it can also have a greater amount of depth. And this is something that is really important, because it means, one, you question the internalized biases in your own curricula, because there's going to be some pressure to read Shakespeare in either role a little bit, right? Well, only on our side do we get lots of marginalized people coming in to critique and saying, hey, there was some anti-Semitism in this, there was some racism that exists, and let's acknowledge it. But second, it just means that in the top levels of academia, you're more likely going to get marginalized people, meaning you get better curricula over time, where they only get on the medium and low levels. Very positive choice.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Then call on the third speaker for the opposition. Here, here.
Alright. I guess I agree with most of opening government's characterization as to why literature matters. I think the issue is that at the point at which the literary canon operates in 2 spheres, right? So both in strict academia, where everyone's talking about what books are good and which books are the best and which ones of them are setting the most precedence, but also in terms of just as average people, what we are exposed to, for example, throughout high school, what is the first literature that we read, what do we think is the most important? Those things also come from the literary canon at the same time. That's very important. I think opening government explains why. We think that on our side, academically, classes would categorize differently, which books they were teaching. They wouldn't use the canon to do so. So they would focus on specific genres, they would focus on specific time periods, or groups of people who wrote these things. We think that socially discourse about the merits of books would be divorced from whether they fit the categories of a specific canon in a world where that canon did not exist. So it's less about whether so-and-so is similar to Shakespeare, or is able to accomplish the same things that he did, and more about a work's unique contribution in a vacuum. Basically, we think that high school AP Lit curriculums are now determined by evolving flexible discourse. This is different from the status quo. But I do want to observe that teachers who care about diversity and exist with enough independence from PTA boards to teach someone like Toni Morrison are going to seek out good diverse literature either way. It is not the case that racist high school teachers will teach diverse authors if and when elite academics decide that they are in the canon. It is also not the case that progressive teachers won't teach diverse authors unless they are introduced to the canon. We don't think that this analysis from opening government made a ton of sense or was grounded in how things were actually likely to play out in the real world. The first argument I'm going to give you then is relatively simple. It's about better literature. We think that we'll just get better books written in our world in the very first place. We think that the establishment of a literary canon always sets standards for what a literary work ought to do. So to be part of this category, authors feel the need to strive towards specific goals, emulate specific conventions, and model particular styles. We think that this is bad because it necessarily restricts creative freedom. This does not just apply to diverse authors, but to all authors. It is better to say that we are going to judge a book on its merits in a vacuum than to try to measure up to specific categories. We think that we get more creativity that way. And this means that you're more likely to get books that appeal to a more diverse group of people. You're more likely to get creative works that, people are more likely to feel connected to, because if the current norms and the current specific conventions aren't drawing in some groups of people, then having more literature that breaks away from those conventions is more likely to appeal to these people. We think that books are meaningful, they can be life-changing, they're generally good for people. It's good to be exposed to a broader world of literature, and that literature is just more likely to be written in the very first place when we eschew the idea of a canon that is going to set the standards as to what good literature is. The second argument I'm going to give you is about having more space for diverse authors, but sure, what's up?
Yeah, you're in a bit of a bind here, because
Okay.
presumably if you have a standardized way of looking across time and genres and selecting works from something, that gets close to a canon. But if you allow teachers to do whatever they want, there's no guarantee they use your model.
I'm a little bit confused about that point, honestly. I don't think that we have a standardized, collection of books that we're sorting everything into and being like, okay, this is a canon work, it's very good, we all like it. We do think that teachers and academics are always going to be talking about what books are meaningful, what books have left a legacy, what books are worth teaching, and we just have a little bit more room to explore what that means, question what it means, and change it as times change as well. I think it's just a more flexible notion of what a good book is, but not throwing out a notion of good books entirely, and it doesn't really make sense to argue that that would be the case. Okay, our second argument is on having more space for diverse authors. I'm going to start here by talking about why side government can never achieve true inclusion. Note that this is the crux of their entire case, and if we take this out, they really don't have anything. Okay, the concept of canon is elitist and academic. They tell you this 17 times when they're talking about how a canon was made in the first place. It's determined by graduate theses and professors. It's removed by the lack of diversity in academia from diverse literature. So we think that these people are likely to make bad choices even when they have really, really good progressive incentives, just because of the fact that they are, A, very much characterized by the norms of their own industry. They've looked at all of these canon works in the past, and they're still going to be intrinsically trying to, measure up to what those things are. But B, just because of a lack of exposure, we think that you're more likely to get things like tokenization of diverse authors. You're more likely to get kind of stereotyping in this sense when you have academics and professors being the ones who set the norms for the industry. Even if they say, it would be very good if we were diverse and inclusive about this, we're not really sure that true inclusion will materialize. We think that perhaps people like Toni Morrison will be uplifted, but generally, real marginalized groups as a whole are not going to be treated fairly. Rather, they're going to be seen as tokens that you introduce to diversify the canon, but the general crux of the canon is going to remain the same, and you don't get real change in the way that we could. We think we're comparatively better, but I have to take another point. So, Jackie, what's up?
Yeah, your side, you want teachers to think through what books are worth teaching. I just want to clarify, how does that thinking of that differ from a critic choosing an award of Book of the Year and choosing which book gets it?
Why does it need to differ? I think we still have awards and Books of the Year and criticisms, but there's just a difference in terms of the broader overarching standard, right? We don't have an established Western canon. We don't have books that we're putting in a category of elite works. We're just talking about whether a book is good. We're still going to make determinations about what books are good. You're still going to have academic criticism, but the nature of that criticism and the benchmarks for what is and isn't good are necessarily changed, right? Okay. Why are we comparatively better at making space for diverse authors? We think that when we get rid of elitist metrics and let books be considered on their own independent merits, this is necessarily good for diverse and marginalized authors, especially at the point at which we're probably going to be looking at how much change a book can do, how much impact it has, because there are just more people writing more now, because marginalized groups have more access to the literary sphere in the present day, we're likely to get the introduction of these texts not in a way where you as an academic are just choosing to uplift a very specific person, but in a way where organically good work, which can come from anyone, is determined, debated, talked about on its merits in a more open and inclusive way. We think the entire literary sphere is essentially much more open when we get rid of the idea of a literary canon in the first place. We don't think that it makes sense to have one elite tier and echelon of good books, and then consider everything outside the canon to be inferior, to not measure up. We would rather open everything up, have everybody just talk about what books they like, and we think that would be like nice and good for people. So, yeah.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd like to call upon the second speaker for the panel.
Starting in 3. Whenever I start my next word. I think that having a shared canon that is deliberately chosen by people who think about the exact decision that they are making every time they pick a class, that is shared amongst a large variety of people who have a common experience that they can talk about, is really, really valuable. And I think the fact that it is likely to be inclusive is, I think, somewhat symmetric, but it is far better on our side when that inclusivity is an explicit consideration in every single in every single curriculum, rather than on their side when it is something that is nebulously done and not protected against by backlash in the space of southern states or whatever they have on their side of the house. The first thing we're going to have is why we think that academics have good incentives, but those good incentives are only likely to manifest on our side of the house. The nuance of this argument is that I think most of these academics come from privileged backgrounds, who come from elite scenarios and have elite discourse and all of the problems that opening opposition points out. The problem is they also have good incentives, which is that they care about teaching inclusive things. These people want to be inclusive. They respond to campus protests. They respond to criticism and things like that. On our side, we set up a framework for them to be deliberate about these choices and to think about how these choices impact every single person, not just in their classroom, but overall as a whole. The problem is right now, a person who is setting a curriculum at Harvard is making a decision that's far larger than a curriculum at Harvard, right? They're making a decision that impacts what classes are taught at vast number of public schools in the country, what education looks like across the world, and what books are considered good. On their side of the house, maybe these people are more deliberate with their choices, but they're only seeing the first order effects of it, of how their 20-person seminar responds to this textbook coming into the class in the first place. On our side, they're likely to think about the broader implications of every single idea that they have, about how the award that they are awarding or the book that they are teaching manifests and trickles down into places. So you're likely to be more explicit about how inclusivity looks like, because you understand that the stake of choosing the canon that you are either officially or unofficially making as a decision has impacts far beyond your classroom and the decision that immediately you see the consequences of. Which means that on our side, when the decision is deliberate, you check back against your unconscious biases. You seek out other outcomes. You look for what kinds of books are responded to well in low-income classrooms and which kinds of books are not responded to well, and you seek out that data to check back against the unconscious biases you have. We think that most of these people want to be liberal, but have these unconscious biases anyways. On our side, we give them a framework to check. I think Benny also gives you other reasons why it's not symmetric. Firstly, you get a large amount of scale, which is that you can teach these things well, so you don't leave it up to the autonomy of classroom teachers who might be racist and might not be, because you have standardized trainings on these standardized curriculums, which means that everyone gets this good teaching. But also you can protect against backlash, because now there are authority figures backing up that decision to teach Toni Morrison in the southern states, and you're more likely to do it on our side of the house. Closing.
Yeah, do you really think that Alabamans are more likely to be oh, I love Toni Morrison because woke Harvard told me that it was really good?
Yes, actually, yes, because they have a huge amount of respect for educational institutions and things that have been historically viewed as valuable in the past, which means that either you're likely to teach Shakespeare, but in a more inclusive way, because the teachers who are teaching it now have this inclusive training on our side of the house. We think that, oh sure, it won't be as good as teaching some really new book, but it'll be much better than it would be otherwise on that side of the house. Opening.
On the thing about choosing what low-income students might respond better to, it seems to me this doesn't probably land on your side for the simple reason that on your side, everyone is forced to teach a certain thing regardless of what the response is. That's the point of the canon by your own argument.
Yeah, but that thing is more inclusive to be chosen with, that thing is chosen to be more inclusive in the first place, right? We think that the low-income teachers and people don't have the ability to necessarily choose the thing that is best for them or have the pedagogical training to, even if they make an independent choice, to back up that choice in the first place. On our side, we're able to tap into vast amounts of resources about how to teach these things, about how these are best responded to in these classrooms in the first place, which means we're able to have the resources to be able to reach out to these places and teach these same kind of literature in the first place. The second thing I'm going to tell you is about how having a shared canon is really valuable, about how making sure that people are reading the same books across the country are actually a really valuable thing. Firstly, I think you allow for more empathy, right? That is to say that when you and another person who have very, very different life experiences are forced to read the same book, you're forced to communicate about how you felt reading the same book, about which characters you found that you empathize with and which characters that they empathize with, and try to understand their perspective. Their best comparative is you judge books on their merit, and you mean that you read something and like everyone like has their own opinions on it, but note that you can never communicate that opinion, right? We think that the large value of why good books are valuable is that they're talked about, they come into public discourse, and they change how people view the world outside. If you're never able to articulate how you view the book world and communicate that to other people who have read completely different, the same book in a completely different interpretation, you're able to have that conversation and dialogue that forces you to build empathy towards other people, which is the starting point for this book coming into public canon in the first place. The third thing we're going to tell you is I think on our side of the house we have a better understanding of what is good literature and what is bad literature. I think in modern society there is a huge problem of how like all art is considered good, but the problem with like the flip side of the implication that all art is good and valuable is that no art is like bad art in the first place. I think there is a qualitative difference between like watching a Marvel movie versus watching like Killers of the Flower Moon, and I think on our side we're better able to teach this difference to students, right? We're better able to show what better writing looks like in the first place, what writing can improve, and how you can demarcate what like good metaphor use is, or good and socially politically valuable use is, what is challenging to the status quo, and what is just entertainment for entertainment's sake, and you're better able to articulate and teach those differences. The strategic implication for this for opening opposition's case is that note that their like framework of like what good books are in a vacuum is never understood by anyone in the real world, right? Because the amount of like media literacy and the amount of like being able to literally analyze the same books is not like present on their side of the house. Given that education is far better on our side of the house to tell you what good books are and why they are good, you're better able to take that same framework and apply that, oh look, maybe this book, which isn't considered to be in the literary canon right now, has the same frameworks, is still good on the same framework that you set out to write this inclusive and literary canon on in the first place, which means you're able to emphasize and explain to people why books are good in the first place. And you're able to develop this literacy in not just like the elite academics who will still probably talk about which good books are good and which books are bad, but in the average person who's able to understand the difference between some book that like is in the canon and some book that isn't, because you're told the answer and then explain to it why the answer is what it is, and that allows you to like work backwards from the reasoning of how this literary canon was constructed and allow you to apply it to other books. Last stuff to like insulate against some of the stuff about like this canon being bad. Firstly, I think we can like have reasonable power to model it to be that the canon updates over time, changes, and has books come in and come out on a reasonable basis based on criticism and responding to like modern trends in literature. For example, a lot of curricula updated after the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020, but also that it's localized, that curricula are not set like globally, but rather set like at the highest levels in each country or each state. Very driving propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. I could call upon the second speaker of the opposition.
Yeah.
Very good. In the modern day, let's say a really good book comes out with a lot of meaningful discourse. You know what happens in our world? People talk about it in the news, people recommend it to their friends. There's a huge amount of conversation about this new up-and-coming book with a really important message, and people interact with it. There are talk shows about it, people talk about it. This happens without it being in the literary canon, because surprise, surprise, the average person does not look and say which books are like the Harvard Press is recommending as the most influential of our time to read, but rather there are other forms of symmetric discourse that probably get better on our side when you don't have to deal with the prescription of the canon. Our claim will be simple. First, that OG is losing on terms of representation, how this actually impacts who reads what. But secondly, the concept of a canon in and of itself is bad. It ruins interactions when you create a set of books that are elitist or better than other books, and it crowds out discourse in meaningful ways. First thing then, on representation and how this canon is chosen in what ways. They claim that on opposition, teachers will pick willy-nilly, or that interest groups like PTAs will weigh in and impact the kinds of books that you teach. I think the nuance they're missing is like, it's not like in status quo, or on their side, there's a policy that says you must teach the canon in A, B, and C ways, because that's not really how literature works or how like segregated like school systems in general, where there are multiple different things, actually act. So if there is a racist teacher or a racist PTA, they retain symmetric power on both sides to impact the kinds of choices you make. I'm not sure they can claim an exclusive benefit, even if they have an inclusive canon, because PTAs in Alabama will just say, we don't want our children learning about X, Y, and Z, even if those woke people at Harvard think that's true. Just gut check against this. I think it's just fundamentally true. They probably don't get to pick that. What do we tell you? First, that there is quite a likelihood that you're going to choose really badly what kinds of things you platform on their side in the canon itself. Why? Because there is a strange trade-off between the literature's quality and the viewpoints or backgrounds of the text themselves. And these two things are not always in line with one another, which means you pick subparly in both of those instances on their side of the house. We are not saying that books by authors of certain backgrounds are necessarily of lower quality. We're saying that there are different things to view in books, and it becomes really, really difficult to inherently pick which ones are best. Why? The first reason is because there are the perverse incentives of those who they claim are actually good on their side of the house to pick. They say that academics at the top are all really, really like bought into the incentive of being inclusive and things like that. I think this is at the top somewhat assertive. I would say that a lot of the people at the top are white, are in places of privilege, and fundamentally don't have the epistemic access needed to actually understand what these things are. Even if they have the best interest, I don't know why it's the case they have the capacity to actually pick, because they're often out of touch with the actual struggles that minority groups, for example, might face, or the actual things that they might resonate well with, which is why you get a ton of like diversity books on their side, which seem really good to the rich white Harvard academic, but don't actually speak to the experience of these people in the most meaningful ways. What does this mean? It means that oftentimes on their side, the kind of picks that they make are actually counterproductive, in that they devalue the canon as a whole at the point at which you have no solvency from them as to why they can pick the most insightful or best forms of books to begin with. But secondly, I think that oftentimes political incentives have the ability to overpower the kind of choices you make in the first place. Because now there becomes a tension of whether you should pick a book because the author is of a certain background, or whether you should pick a book because the prose is really beautiful in a certain way. And I think the kinds of tensions you get when this actually occurs means you make worse choices as a whole, because there is a split in discourse between what the canon should actually present. What that means on their side is oftentimes the kind of books that you pick don't have the resonating factor, don't have the teaching factor, because they're trying to platform too many different kinds of discourse in ways that mean they muddy the waters far more. I'll take opening.
Or you're in a double bind. Either your teachers are woke, in which case they do the same problem of picking tokenizing books, or they're not and they pick old canon books. On our side, you seek out and find those books that are both good literarily and have good and diverse perspectives.
Right. The thing that OG didn't prove, and maybe CG will prove this to you, is why you can pick books that have both those capacities, giving their different incentives and different understandings from people who are picking the canon in the first place. Because either you're a literary professor of Shakespeare who knows about old prose and things like that, or you're like, I don't know, an African studies major who understands the tensions between these things and can select in those ways. I don't know why these groups can work together. I don't know why they make good choices in the end. Why do we get better discourse on our side? Because as I've already told you, there are other ways to platform what kinds of books are good. For example, social movements can say, look at this new book by this African-American author and the message that it presents. There can still be a huge amount of traction in the contemporary sphere about what kinds of books you get. And I'm going to explain why you interact with those things better on our side. But first, on the idea of representation and whether you recognize minority authors more on their side. The first problem here is one of capacity. Because at the end of the day, you can only pick so many books to be in the canon for it to retain the ability of being high class or really good literature. What does this mean for the kinds of authors that you pick? The first problem is that when you can't platform everyone, or even a meaningful amount of people, there's a zero-sum game between the kinds of quality that you interact with in terms of minority authors. This problem doesn't exist in the status quo, because black authors can just say, we have a good book, but the literary canon is really westernized and stuff like that, and they don't recognize African-American authors to begin with. So because we are not in the canon does not mean that the books we make are not actually good. But on their side, when the canon also recognizes things like diversity or different backgrounds, that means that when you are not in the canon on their side, and there's structural reasons why a lot of people who might write good books won't be in that canon, they are devalued far, far more, because now they are seen as a lower class of literature which otherwise wouldn't exist. So it is far harder on their side of the house to actually break into the sphere, one, because of the bad incentives at the top, but two, because you just have too many things to platform. And when you're not platformed on their side, you are seen as comparatively a worse author and harder to actually get sales and things like that. But the second thing to note here then is that this creates pressure to conform or emulate really popular things within status quo to begin with. Because there's a certain type of book on their side which they elevate as a canon because of certain characteristics in it, and now all of the authors, whether they are minority or majority authors, must have conformed to this to try to be in that canon in the first place. The problem intensifies on their side, but there's a problem inherent with the canon itself. I'll take openings.
The problem of over-selecting is far worse in your world. We have to choose from every genre and time period, as opposed to in our world, we just say, what are good books?
So
let's include a lot under that category.
This is what Ollie said, right? Because there are reasons why you can specialize in our world, and there isn't a prescriptive narrative of what is a good book in general. So there are ways to make better choices on our side. I'll get to that in a second. Keep closing. Opening. One more, I guess.
Oh, I think you took, yeah, I mean,
Alright, last thing I'm going to talk about then is the interaction with the canon and why they're actually far better on our side. The first thing to note is that the canon on their side is prescriptive. It tells people what is good and not good, but this becomes counterproductive, especially if you believe that the choices made are subpar. How do teachers interact with this in ways that are worse on their side? There exists discourse on either side of the house about what teachers should teach. Things like teaching resources are symmetric because there are still teaching resources for books that are contemporary and not involving the canon and status quo, but teachers can still talk to each other and figure out what to teach. What we think happens on our side is that you get the ability to be more free and flexible with what you actually interact with and aren't framed out of things that don't make it into the canon like you are on their side. Because on our side, you can pick the things that are actually most in line with what you want to teach or most in line with whatever curriculum you have. We think that this is an important restrictive factor. The second thing is how people actually interact. Because the existence of whether something is canon or not changes how the everyday person interacts with it. Because when I picked up Anna Karenina last weekend and wanted to read it, a lot of people laughed at me because they said, that's a really highbrow random book, why are you reading that? So we claim that when you're talking about classics, it happens to be the case that a lot of people choose not to engage with canon things when they are seen as highbrow or above the range that they would otherwise interact with. And we think this means that you frame out where the discussion about the most diverse or important books happens, because now it happens in like university classrooms instead of in the hands of the everyday person. We think that's rather important and practical.
Thank you very much for the speech. I got one third speaker for the council.
You're here.
The universal themes of love and loss that is expressed throughout art is something that we think that people inherently gain value from, especially when it comes from perspectives that are outside of their own. It is a culture that we want to preserve. It is an inherent value that we want to prioritize. Two things in this speech. Firstly, why people's conception of high art is highly malleable and why that means we allow them to internalize the importance of these works despite whatever subjective experience they may gain from the art. And secondly, how that empowers minority actors by not only allowing them to be more represented in positions of power, but also how that preserves and continues their legacy throughout the history of art. Firstly, why are people's conception of high art incredibly malleable? I want to note that most people are highly insecure about their own opinions of art exactly because there is such a dominant narrative that highbrow art and high culture is something that general people cannot engage with. Despite this, most people feel as if they want to be let into this sophisticated class that understands what it is, that has read Shakespeare and gets it and genuinely likes it and doesn't have to go to SparkNotes in order to translate it, that they are let in on sort of the most important magnum opuses of human history. Because I think importantly, a lot of people have the urge to be able to interact with what they perceive to be and what society has agreed to be in terms of the most important works that express fully what it means to be a human, which is what we provide them on our side of the house. Why then is this narrative going to be compelling from Alabama to Berkeley? Couple of reasons. Firstly, the technical expertise is still there. That is to say that these proses, these arts, they are compelling from an emotional sense, just technically speaking in terms of the quality of the writing, to the extent where if you tell people that it is important, they are likely going to be able to find that within the quality of the text itself. But why is it largely a question of framing? And I want to note here that art can be viewed in a subjective context in terms of how people experience and relate to it on the ground in the moment. It can be viewed politically in the sense of thinking that something is a part of a culture war, as we're seeing, for example, in like trans textbooks that are read in classrooms, or it can be viewed experientially. The thing is, we want these texts to be viewed upon as works of art that are independently supposed to be evaluated outside of just how they make you feel when you are consuming them in and of itself. This is important because context is incredibly indicative and instrumental to how people actually relate to that art itself. So when people watch MCU movies, for example, they're only thinking about the fun and the spectacle while they're there, as opposed to the legitimate quality in terms of the narratives and why it is that the themes that are expressed are important, and why the fact that those themes are technically expressed are something that is really illuminating about the human experience itself. This is bad at the point in which when you engage with that art on a purely subjective level, where you're reading for the sake of reading, you're reading for the sake of enjoyment, your biases are the most proximate things, and because of the fact that they are uniquely what define the way that you engage with that art. The question of being a part of a canon then forces you to take yourself outside of your own perspective and to evaluate this piece of art not only in the way that you view it, but in the way that it's important in the story of human history and human art on a whole. When you make that art more challenging then you force people to go outside of their comfort zone and saying that even though I might not not personally relate to that text. That doesn't matter because this text objective value exists outside of it necessarily it is I think about this. And I think you'll find this conception incredibly compelling and plausible given how many people just hate the classics when they do read them, how many people complain about James Joyce and Shakespeare. But the fact then that we have the narrative that distills down and trickles down is why people are forced then to care about it. Because when people are overwhelmed with the choice in terms of the types of arts they can engage in, when people feel as if there is no starting place, that's why they care about things such as the Harvard Press, because they want that guidance there. But specifically, it's about the fact that people feel as if engaging the canon is engaging in a broader act of historiosity, in terms of understanding the progression of art overall, and knowing how it is that human beings became more and more representative, more and more inclusive in the narratives that they set, and how that art builds off of each other. I think the framing here is in terms of how rap and hip-hop became something that was so politically charged, that was so divisive between groups that supported it from a personal level, and how it is now seen as something that is highly respected within the musical industry in and of itself, because people were forced to look at it not only in terms of whether or not they identify with the beats itself, but part of the broader history of how it relates to African music-making traditions, how it relates to broader narratives of being more inclusive, and why people care about that implicitly. Closing.
This is ridiculous. No one was like, rap is high art because it relates to jazz and cultural traditions. They were like, it sells a lot and it sells a lot of albums. That's why we care about it.
No. This is just objectively untrue. The fact that, for example, Kendrick Lamar can win a Pulitzer Prize for Damn is the type of conversation, discourse changing progression in terms of the view on hip hop in general that creates a binary in which people feel as if they do not engage with hip hop personally. It is part of that of failing, and they have to check their own biases in terms of why it is that something that has been recognized so strongly by critics they do not personally connect with. Opening.
See, but you can still win an award on our side without being in the canon. The unique thing that the canon points out, as he does point out, is it otherizes the normal person and pushes them away from it because it's highbrow instead of interactable.
No, the majority of people would like to relate to that conception of themselves. They want to build an idea that they are civilized, that they understand, and are sophisticated in their cultural taste. Why do we empower minorities then? A couple of mechanisms here. The first is the breaking of the narratives that Westerners are specifically sophisticated and uniquely tense in terms of their technical expertise, and changing the establishment norm in order to do that in the exact characterization that I was talking about before. But secondly, it is the longevity and memory that we allow them to take a place and hold within the literary canon itself. The fact that we preserve a snapshot of the place and time, the unique experience, what it was like to be an Iranian refugee in the 1970s, what it's like to be a factory worker in China in the 2010s, these specific snapshots and their perennial themes are something that people are forced to engage in at the point in which that moment of time and that unique experience that necessarily universalizes to oppression all over the world is something that people are forced to engage in. Why is this good, practically speaking? The first is just mechanistically the way that academia has to transform to encompass this. When you have, for example, more minorities in positions of power, because diversity is broadly seen as an inherent value in it itself. But the comparative advantage is being able to empower previously under-platformed voices and under-expressed voices. When you have more boards and departments that are made up of those voices, you necessarily lead to future reforms in which you change things such as the narratives and the standards and the cultural lenses in which academics are forced to look at things. The exploration then of, for example, like more support of translations to ensure that like more of this art itself can be exposed is something that we uniquely get on our side of the house. The second is just the broad continuation of how the media industry itself reacts when they feel that these are safe bets to turn into, for example, movies or franchises, or broadly push within the dominant narrative, exactly because they are seen as standard parts of the canon. But thirdly, in terms of how it is that within time, over the decades, when this art consistently gets remembered, that means that people have to acknowledge that was an incredibly important period of human history and an incredibly worthwhile and relevant, relatable narrative that people can all gain value from. Incredibly proud to say in closing.
There you go.
Thank you very much for that speech. I call upon the third speaker for the opposition.
Apologies in advance for my voice. Usually I'm audible, so you rarely have to say in person. Right. My observation about opening half is it's very unclear what changes, because we have this picture of a set of progressive people who are the tastemakers, and they pick which text we like either way. And then we have a set of conservative people who just don't listen to them on either side. And on both sides we seem to have judgments being made about which texts are valuable. It is, I think, quite unclear at this point in the debate how those judgments differ and what that delta, so to speak, is. Closing opposition then will be very precise about what typifies a canon and why it is specifically perverse, as opposed to just ordinary critique, taste, or making judgments about taste. So, a couple of things in this speech. Firstly, I'm just going to clarify what is a canon and why is it different from like the Harvard Book Review or book prizes. And then I'll explain I'll get into it. I'll explain the two things I think typify canons, stasis and elitism. Alright, firstly, I want to note that empirically, it is just not true that what wins awards is necessarily the canon. And you should ask yourself, like, is the film canon just a list of best Oscar picture winners? No, of course it isn't. There is, I think, far more that goes into the construction of the canon. I think that's broadly conceded, actually, in a way that arguments are made at opening government, insofar as they understand that this is constructed through judgment, through a set of tastemakers. But the bulk of the rest of their case requires you to believe that the canon is just like a list of books that are good. I do not think that is what it is. I think they need to be far more specific to explain why the perception of text as being high culture or as being classic is necessary to get their benefits, which broadly are just books that are good. So, two things then I think that typify the canon. Firstly, I think the canon must be high culture. And of course, what we consider high culture can shift, but it must be high culture. What does that mean? Really, it just means that there must be some conception of a divide between elite and pop text. That could be in form, it could be in style, it could be in subject matter. But innately, this is about the concept that there are a set of people who can do gatekeeping, who can decide which things are good by virtue of being high culture, and which things are bad by virtue of being non-elite. And crucially, necessary within this conception of the canon is the premise that the set of things that people like and that people organically care about are not necessarily good and are in fact unlikely to be until they're determined to be good by a gatekeeper. The second thing I'll note is that it's static. That is to say that classics get institutionalized into the canon over time, and the canon is broadly skewed toward text. In the past, I want to note that merely adding contemporary novels is insufficient here. That is, there is far more weight afforded to the novels that were added historically. They have far more historical value in the kind of snobbish terms of CG. And OG is like, well, you can update the canon. No, of course you can't. It's incredibly difficult, incredibly unpopular, and it's atheoretical. Because the idea of the canon is that these are the fundamental texts of the canon upon which all the others build. So, elitism and stasis. I'm going to explain why both of those things are bad, why these are the highest impact pieces of material in the debate. Firstly, on stasis. The first thing I want to note here is just that old texts are often bad. And that is not just because they have individual problematic depictions that we can edit out or that we can shift. It's because they are necessarily created in a context that is like replete with biases. The tropes that CG likes and wants people to bond over because they're universal themes are often incredibly misogynistic, for instance. They are things like, the sad woman left at home by her husband or whatever. And that kind of thing is actually perhaps not that value to hallow and to protect as a kind of foundation of all of the rest of our literature. And I would also note that I do not think it is that easy to appreciate it or critique it in the way that they describe. Like, ask yourself, is it the case that you can very easily critique misogyny within a lot of classics? I think it is not. I think it's often considered something which is woke, which is, like the woke nut jobs in Harvard taking over our education system or whatever. And I think it's probably like an inefficient way to deal with the kind of misogyny within these texts. But I would also just note that I think that these texts are like dead weight, insofar as they are, by CG's own admission, harder for people to relate to, less interesting to the average consumer. They do not tell us that much about our lives. They take up dead weight in curricula, and I think that's especially true, for instance, in developing countries, where for some reason, because these texts were decided by some guy to be valuable like 100 years ago, you must take up time in your curriculum learning about the supposedly universal truths of people in Europe 400 years ago, rather than your own national texts and national stories. I think that is tragic. I'll take a point from Berkeley now.
When the thing that is studied by snobs is also studied by everyone else, this allows for far more empathy towards minority people from snobs, but also allows non-snobs to encourage thinking deeply about literature rather than viewing their entertainment as purely entertainment.
Come on, you can think deeply about low culture. That's ridiculous. What our claim is quite clearly that you should value low culture. You should not ratify the separation between elite and low culture texts. You are the ones who establish that hierarchy of snobbery. It's not good enough to just promote some into the upper echelon. I'll take the point from closing now.
If people use these metrics and understand that YA is more relevant and more easy to read than, for example, like Toni Morrison's poetry, then how do you get any people to look at these important pieces?
Yeah, well, I think the problem with your conception of literature here is you're I guess just doing the elitism, right? You're like, well, there's low culture texts and there's high culture texts, and you guys will do the low culture ones and we'll do the high culture ones. No, like we'll do both, right? And also, like, you pick examples. You're like, the MCU, they're not very good. But like Everything Everywhere All at Once is also a low culture text. I don't think we should pretend it's high culture. I don't think we should pretend it's not high culture. But we should value it, and we should be able to make judgments about low culture text. Our claim is that the idea of the canon is a distortionary one. When we do analysis, it is not valuable. On elitism, two things to note. Firstly, this makes your analysis of literature weaker, and we have that on full display from Closing Government. Basically, this forces you to analyze text with reference, firstly, to previous books in the canon, because the theory of the canon is books build upon each other, and therefore they must, you must appreciate the earlier books to understand the present ones, which, first of all, skews the sets of books that you add. Maybe it's true that you add Toni Morrison, but you're far less likely to add something which, for instance, is in a different form, that is not viewed to be canonical. But, sorry. I note that Orwell asserts this, but the reason here is that the very theory of the canon requires it, and because everyone learns exactly the same sets of classics, they enter a form of groupthink, where the ways that they analyze those books in the first instance is prescriptive and is hard to relate. But finally, I want to note that this elitism is principally incoherent. Ask yourself if it is good that canon doesn't reflect what people actually value and enjoy within text. The Closing Government thinks it is, because they're like, well, liking things that are elite makes people feel clever. So we should just make it a bit easier to like things that are elite. But my claim is, no, we should actually make people engage with books on a deeper level. One that is not just about showboating, about how clever you are. And I think you can do that at the point where you're not just glorifying a very prescriptive set of canonical texts, of canonical ways of expressing yourself via text, not just telling people it's important, and therefore building a series of cognitive dissonances about what people like and what people think are actually good. But crucially, you're unlocking the capacity to meaningfully engage with low culture text without simply every now and then cherry picking a low culture text here and here to enter into the high culture club. This is not an analytical frame that makes people engage with texts effectively, which makes people engage with text deeply or diversely. So proud to report.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'll call on the final speaker for the testimony.
CO spells out the exact misconceptions that are keeping minority artists down in the status quo, which is rap sells, hip-hop sells, and graffiti is very popular, but that's lowbrow art and that's street art, and therefore these people, even if people really like them and these albums make tons of money, they shouldn't be directing a musical program at a university. They shouldn't be on the board of an award ceremony determining who gets to win this award because it's lowbrow art, it's popular art, but it is cheap art. That's the exact mechanism of legitimacy that Eddie gives you, which is when you recognize them through the canon, through the words that invoked through classics, and say, this is part of our classics and what we should be teaching our children, and recognize it with the Pulitzer Award. That's when these art feels like highbrow art, and people of color assume positions of power, like directing the American Studies program, which Toni Morrison did do in Princeton. But this doesn't mean that this art is not going to be resonating with people, because Shakespeare in its time was literally lowbrow English, crappy English, new words that everyday people use, that the elite don't use, and different rhyming schemes. So these awards do recognize what people like and have this value, and which is why we don't think just because it is high culture, low culture, certain arts will be excluded. With that being said though, CO cases out, let's tell you why Eddie's extension wins the round in two ways. First of all, I want to talk about preserving old books and preserving literature. Because the deadlock in every other house in this debate is everyone wants to dispute with you which side is more racist, which side is more exclusionary, but the truth is with the fiat of the motion, both sides are decently inclusive. It literally says we're debating about a diverse set of books on either side. So I don't think racism is a huge difference on either side. The way clearer distinction between the two sides in this debate is whether there is a canon or there is not a canon. And Eddie has told you why having a canon is super, super valuable. What did Eddie say? We told you that on their side of the house, old books are not going to get read for two reasons. One, there's a huge barrier and difficulty in reading old language that if you don't give them a meaningful boost in motivation, they simply won't pick up an old book. Secondly, their mechanism, I quote OO, is your friends will recommend to you which books they like. What determines what your friends read? It's which corporation paid for the most ads on Instagram, TikTok, on billboards to drive you to buy certain books or purchase certain things on Amazon by hyperlinking it on your Instagram feed. This hugely favors white artists, white firms that are extremely rich, but moreover, it just means that you won't pick up an old old book without being exclusively told there's another reason, because old books can't purchase ads for themselves and they can't occupy your attention. You need something going for them. This is why we uniquely preserve the ability for us to read old books, because one, it feels grand, it feels important, but second of all, you will feel like there's something that helps my children in a very important way and you're more motivated to take them. They said, when this art seems too highbrow as a canon, we're deterred from it. But no, in reality, we take our kids to tours in Ivy League schools. We show them like manuscripts from ancient libraries because we think these things are deemed as valuable, teaches them something too. So we think deeming these books as valuable motivates parents to help their children pick it up as well. And this is valuable for a lot of ways, but also nobody disputes this. Like literature captures our history. It is good to interact with this qualitative documentation of history to complement our more quantitative and like facts-based history teaching in school. We get a snapshot into the actual cultures, struggles, and personify this history, and also just like tracking the change in time. It's just very acutely racist when we pick up a book that has the N-word in it, right? So it's important for us to engage in this criticism when we continuously pick it up and think about how times have changed in a good way and things like that. So we preserve old art, which inherently has cultural value. This is an independent road to victory, given we directly tie this to canon, whereas racism is honestly like not the hugest delta, given everyone is defending a diverse set of books. But let's go ahead and talk about uplifting minorities and break this deadlock as well. Let's look at what Opening Hab has talked about representation, criticize them first, and bring in Eddie. Firstly, let's talk about OG. They just said that there's incentive to pick well, and therefore we represent minorities. What is left to me unclear is, what does this representation exactly do for minority communities? Why is it important that a white person reads a book about black culture in school? What does that exactly translate to? The impact is very wishy-washy. But let's look at OO. I think OO is way more problematic in this debate, because what they said is that representation is bad because it's not that many, it's limited, and it's also tokenistic, it's just a quota, and won't actually resonate with people. It's problematic in two ways. One, where is the comparative? Why is it that your friends will proactively choose really woke books and recommend it to you, given that's your mechanism? But two, just because there's a quota for women doesn't mean we will be employing incompetent women, because there's a surplus of competent women who are just not getting recognized because there is no quota and there is sexism. Similarly, just because we're going to specify it's a diverse set doesn't mean we won't pick good resonant books because there's a surplus of them. We're just forcing people to pick them out and include them in the canon. Moreover, I think what Opening wants to discuss, which is education, is pretty much a wash because they want to discuss the most like extreme scenarios. The racist Alabama teacher will probably say racist things in the classroom no matter what they're reading, no matter which book is on the table. I don't think that's where the delta is. But Eddie gives you two unique ways in which we uplift minorities. The first is we spell out how we actually legitimize minority art by talking to you about how this award has an effect. Sure.
The problem on your side is that no one interacts with the art by your own members' analysis. We told you there are social movements, other narrative things in community that make sure that contemporary books do platform good or discursive things in ways that you lose out on.
Wait, that's literally an assertion. Like, one, we literally told you, most families want to expose their kids to, like, this thing to give them cultural exposure. You need to put it in a museum and call it a canon first, or her parents choose it first. But second of all, that's the second mechanism that Eddie tells you, right? Which is that you get more exposure through two ways. One, when firms want to create a movie version of a book, they feel way more confident sponsoring a minority culture book if it's like has a Pulitzer Prize and that pull and that can bring in more consumers who are less proximate to these experiences. Closing.
The entirety of this argument only exists in a world in which you venerate the canon, i.e. in a world in which you don't have Pulitzers or don't care so much about Pulitzers. It doesn't matter. Like, you don't need these things to actually pull in it. The only reason you do is because they have it on their
That's
side.
an even further jump because the Pulitzer right now honors things like The Green Book, Parasite, and literally won the Oscars. But we don't devalue the Oscars. We tell our children just to watch these movies and we think of it as interesting. Like, it is just the reason is because the ethics of the ethos of all these books over all these generations has compiled in our hearts, which is why we believe in the canon, because it's literally what we learned, and like it came from this source. We hear about the 96 Oscar ceremony, and that's why we believe in it. So it's unclear to me. They need to prove to you why one movie chosen is going to outweigh all of that history as well. Firms are more like the back of revival of The Great Gatsby or The Green Book if there is this legitimacy that says like people will come in because people want to see this like really famous book on the screen, and so we get more exposure in that way. But two, even if only one author makes it on our side, when we recognize them as highbrow authors or people who are really legitimate, that's when universities and boards employ them. They can change the rubric of evaluation. They can employ more people like minority artists or give awards to more minority artists. These are all things that are very exclusive to our side. We're still at their house, even if it sells, they're never legitimize and recognize because they don't have the weapon of the word canon to give it a sense of ethos, and that's why they don't have any of these effects. The actual tight law breakthrough in this debate is about who can get people to pick up old books so we can engage in this cultural preservation, but more importantly, outside of education, there are many ways to legitimize minority artists. We're the ones who give that to you, proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd like to call upon the final speaker for the opposition.
The importance of literature is that it is subjective. Blood meridian means something different to me than it does to you or to anyone else in this group. The over-standardization and over-interpretation of works, a requirement of the canon, is what drains the life and joy out of literature. And it is also the thing that grounds an inclusive canon into what best befits the style of what is the next Odyssey, what is the next Faulkner. It is the one that says Toni Morrison is good because she looked like what Faulkner did, but a little more woke. The one that says Arundhati Roy could never have existed without Dickens. That is what an inclusive canon looks like for the reasons that Ellie points out to you at Extension, which I just do not think are engaged with at all by closing government. The fact that they spend 20 seconds charitably responding to us in an extension that covers lots of different things, I think is damning for them. I want to be clear here. In their best case scenario, the reason why they get legitimacy off of these things like Pulitzers or anything else like that, the reason why they need it is because right now, minority art is in competition against the Western canon. And so you need to legitimize it by the means of grounding it in these elite academic tropes. The comparative is simple. In the absence of a canon, there is nothing to be dismissive of minority art against. And this is the actual case of rap. Like, when you hear conservatives critiquing rap, they're not like, rap is bad because it's bad. They're like, it's bad because it's not Beethoven or any of these things. And that is the problem. The existence of a Western canon is exactly what pushes more minorities out unless they conform to certain standards. That is the material Ellie gives you. That is why we win the CO extension. Lots of things come out at CO. I want to talk about 3 specific things that mean that we are far ahead of anyone else in this debate. Then I'm going to engage in CG, even though they didn't really engage in us, talk about OG, talk about opening opposition. So, 3 things that Ellie gives you. They actually give you a lot more things, but I think 3 things I want to talk about specifically first. 1, that this grounds literature in static, harmful tropes. And I think this is important. The argument that Ellie makes is crucial, that the set of inclusive literature is tokenistic towards minorities, not because it just says we have black authors and stuff like that, but because the way that the people choose what looks like canon is what looks like other works. And I want to be clear here about why our impact comes over whatever opening opposition says. Because simply, the argument that Ellie makes is that the kinds of tropes that you have in these classic Western canons are the ones that are bad, not for the sake of the reason that, like, it's a white man and he said something's bad, and if you excise certain parts of that and make it woke, everything is good. But these structural things that these texts do themselves is harmful. In the Odyssey, it is a philandering man that cheats and has affairs, but is expected, his wife is expected to stay loyal after 20 years, wait for him and pine away from him. It is that sort of trope that is replicated, that even if you have an Asian American author or a black female author, that trope is what the Harvard professor looks for and says, ah, that reminds me of the Odyssey. That is the sort of thing that I value. It is the same way how if you have fairy tales like Cinderella or stuff like that, that the essential parts of that are bad are not like what the Grimm brothers wrote about, like cutting people's heels off, but the fact that women are seen to be as nothing more than agents of like the princess that they have. And I think that is the problem here. Because insofar that you are building up a new canon, the way that you do it is perverse. The second thing to say here, and I just think this is obvious, it's a straightforward first-order consequence of eliminating the Western canon, but all of these things take up very limited space in curricula. And I just think CG agrees with this. They're just like, all of the old books are going to fall out and no one wants to read them. Good. I do not know the impact of this. I personally think maybe my life has been improved by reading the Odyssey because I happen to like Greek books, but I guarantee you a million other people don't think that is the case. And I think they needed to put in a lot more work to prove to you that why that was the case. And I want to be clear here. In a comparative world, it is literally just far more likely that the weight of canon that Ellie explains to you, that the fact that it has existed for 500 years or thousands of years is exactly what keeps it over any other minority art. It is why in AP English literature, you learn the Odyssey, you learn Shakespeare, you learn Dickens, months, years before you learn Toni Morrison or any of her books. It is why you spend one book on them and you read 3 books of Shakespeare and you're like, that is the canon. And I think to be clear here, Ellie explains this, it also works against OG, and it's important. Because the point is that because this Western canon has existed for longer, and the way you teach the inclusive canon or justify it is as an extension of the Western canon, it makes it far more likely that people venerate this more. I'll talk about how this interacts with opening government later. The last thing I want to talk about under our extension is that this is just a bad frame to critique literature. It produces groupthink in regards to old texts. It creates cognitive dissonance. It drives people out of engaging with literature for all the same reasons that Ellie talked about. It constrains and forms your perspective even for minority text. So I think CO, in some sense, is a clear one. We tell you about why you do not get like the better things that they want. And I think literally in a pure mathematical sense, if we stop teaching the Odyssey and we stop teaching Shakespeare, it means there's a lot more space to do Zora Neale Hurston, Toni Morrison, and anyone else. I think that in and of itself gives you all the inclusive benefits that opening government and closing government want. Closing government. I just think there is no impact to a lot of their case. It is unclear to me as to why we need to snapshot the specific stories that are quote-unquote the Iranian refugee in the 1980s over things that are ever evolving and matter far more for local context. The extension told you this, and in developing countries it is more important to venerate not the Odyssey, not Homer traditions, not Dickens, but to talk about, to teach Nehru's discovery of India, which should be taught in more Indian primary schools, but isn't because people are still somewhat reliant on what the Western canon is. It is the fact that minority art is never big enough by all the arguments that we gave you at extension, and the only reason you needed legitimacy is to compete against the Western canon. All the stuff they told you about how this is very hard to, in some sense, why you bear reading these things. Actually, OG first.
Choosing the art that people like is just the same as choosing what is palatable, which is just as susceptible to groupthink. We explained to you that a standardized canon is the only way to get to deep analysis with difficult topics, and that it is adaptable.
No, closing. I'll respond to that later, but yeah.
If art is subjectively evaluated, then if you do not like a piece of minority art because you don't relate to it, that is bad art. On our side, we force them to engage with the objective quality outside of their subjective experience.
I think it is nonsense to be like any piece of art is objective quality. Blood Meridian is a fantastic book. I love it. It's one of my favorite books. It is incredibly hard to read. It's run-on sentences all the time. I think if you were to say, oh, this book is sick because it's got objective quality, I just think a million people would disagree with you. But it can still be part of canon. I don't think that argument makes much sense coming from closing government. Opening government. Their argument is essentially a diverse canon is good because canon constructors make diverse choices, academics make good choices, they impose this on lots of other people, and that's good. The problem here is very simple. The motion is not this house would replace an existing canon with an inclusive canon. It is just this house establishes another canon. So they have to defend against the fact that other people still say, well, there is a Western canon, there is the Odyssey, we should still care, we should still teach all these other books. And the problem is that those will always be more important. So people in schools are still going to teach the Odyssey, they're still going to teach all of these things. They're going to say, like Toni Morrison, the American classics, and I just, by the way, this is functioning the status quo. The establishment of an inclusive canon is exactly what academics have been trying to do. But you still have lots of people in lots of schools that teach the Odyssey at the expense of Toni Morrison, because guess what? The Western canon is just so much more important because it is held up, because it is venerated. So that beats opening government as well, beats the closing government extension. I think we're more important than what our opposition says.
Thank you very much for that debate.